So you said that you think we're going to have hate speech laws in the U.S. I mean, it seems like there's still some respect for the First Amendment, at least in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Do you think they would actually allow for a hate speech law passed by Congress to stand?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know. They had a good decision a couple of days ago on free speech, where the NRA, the National Rifle
Yeah,
Association,
that was very good.
was being persecuted by was it in New York?
It was New York State
New York
banking
State Attorney
regulators.
General.
Yeah.
Yeah, they wanted to compel banks to stop dealing with the NRA because their philosophy is out of bounds. We can't have people advocating gun rights. We have to shut them down, and let's do it by whatever means we can. And one of the means is by pressuring the banks into not dealing with them, not financing them, etc. And the Supreme Court decided unanimously, by the way, which was really
Yeah.
a little bit surprising, surprisingly, happily surprising, ruled that this was a violation of their rights and had to be overturned. So your question is whether do I think the Supreme Court would allow hate speech laws in America? I think they would if it were initially done pretty mildly. So, for example, just to concoct something, if some state or the federal government had a law saying um, you cannot call for um, you cannot call for the treatment, or let's put it this way, you cannot endorse the institution of slavery that existed in the United States in the past. You cannot say it's a good thing and I'm sorry it was gone and we should try to reinstate it. So if it was something, a law like that, which is clearly targeted to something irrational,
Yeah.
something unjust, a view that's unjustified, but which still should be legal, it's conceivable to me that the court would allow it. The conservatives on the court would allow it. They would not today allow, an overtly, a more overtly restriction on free speech that you can't advocate. You can't say something critical about Donald Trump, or you can't say something positive about Donald Trump. They wouldn't tolerate that. But I think there's a wedge that I think would be accepted, unfortunately. Yeah.
The first hate speech laws in Europe were all against Holocaust deniers. So the first
Yeah.
speech that was banned in Europe was Holocaust denial in Germany and then the rest of Europe. So that's
Yeah.
how it starts, was
Yeah.
something seemingly legitimate, right?
Exactly. That would be the kind of thing where I think the Supreme Court might tolerate it. You're speaking about hate speech. I'm going to be speaking at OCON about package deals. And the hate speech, this idea, this concept of hate speech is a mega package deal. First, it packages together, equates legitimate hatred and illegitimate hatred. So if I say I hate Nazism, I hate Hitler, I think Hitler is the worst person that ever existed, they say, okay, that's hate speech, and that's the same as saying I hate Donald Trump, or I hate the ACLU, whatever. So they equate that. And then further, this idea of this package deal of hate speech, excuse me, equates disagreement with hate. So if I say, I disagree with laws about affirmative action, that's hate speech. It means you hate blacks. If you disagree with affirmative action, it means you hate blacks. So again, this is this ridiculous package deal. And the final, the triple aspect of this package deal is that it equates hate or disagreement with action. It says if you hate blacks, let's say you actually do, I hate blacks. I don't want to associate with them. I don't want to invite them for dinner. I don't want my daughter to marry. That's equivalent to action. It's equivalent to shooting or lynching them. And again, that's a ridiculous package deal. And so the those of you who want to come to Ocon, I have a lot to say about package deals and
Good.
how destructive and prevalent they are. And this is a really good example of it.
So what do you think about, a lot of people accuse Twitter and Facebook and those companies of censorship, of violating free speech, in that they take certain people off, they have restrictions, and there's a lot of agitating around, the government should stop them from doing that, make them neutral, public square platforms.
Yeah, I'm actually going at length into that in my talk. So I'll give you a
Oh,
little
good.
bit of preview. Um, this is part of a very, very dangerous package deal about censorship, because the proper meaning of censorship is the government bans you from expressing your ideas about something. Government says you can't publish a book, can't publish an article. That's censorship. Today, they've distorted that concept to have it apply to private action, such as Facebook refusing to accept your post. Now, Facebook is a private company, and it does have the right to accept or reject your post. It's an expression of its freedom of speech, in fact, to decide, I don't want to be associated with that idea because I find it offensive or disagreeable. That's part of its free speech right. Yet today, people are saying that's censorship. And it's coming from the conservatives. The conservatives are saying they're upset that, I think, Facebook or Twitter banned Trump, right? They banned
They
Trump
both
from
banned Trump. Yeah.
both of them. They banned her. That's really upsetting to them. They say, how could you do this? This violates the freedom of speech. Trump should have a right, etc. And the people who mistakenly, let's grant them honestly, mistakenly, are sympathetic to this argument because they say, well, Facebook is not really a totally private company. It's regulated by the government. It has to kowtow to the government. Let's say that that's their argument. It's such a contradiction, because if the problem with Facebook, if the reason Facebook should not be treated as a strictly private entity is because it has some government involvement, how on earth is the solution to
Increase.
accelerate that government involvement? How's the solution to have let's have more government regulation, more government control, telling Facebook or Twitter what it can and can't publish? So the solution is get the government out of the way entirely, including getting it out of the way of any decision by these private entities over what should and shouldn't be published.
So there is a case in the Supreme Court, in front of the Supreme Court. I think they're going to make a decision any day now about how involved the government can be in decisions that these platforms make with regard to speech. Because, I mean, there's evidence that they were putting a lot of pressure on these platforms around COVID in terms of what these platforms should and shouldn't be saying.
Well, that's unquestionable. I mean, and the Supreme Court ruled on that earlier. It said that it was the government was wrong, had no right to.
That was the appellate. The Supreme Court hasn't ruled yet.
It was the appellate court?
Yeah.
Are you sure? Okay,
Yeah.
my mistake. But it was the appellate court, which was a good decision,
Yes.
which said that the government pressure on Facebook to exclude, quote, disinformation about COVID or other things, disinformation about the campaign, about the election, about Trump, that is wrong. Government has no right to do that. We've gone so far from the original idea of what government's function is, which is to use force to defend attacks on people's rights, use force in retaliation against threats to individual rights, which means that anything the government does has to be part of that defense of individual rights. Otherwise, it shouldn't be doing it. So for people to argue, which they did in this appellate case, for people to argue that this isn't really government putting a gun to somebody's head, it's just saying we strongly encourage you, to do this. We really
Yeah.
urge you to take into account that we'll be very upset if you don't comply. To somehow interpret that as not threatening force is absurd.
I'm actually worried about what the Supreme Court's going to do here because in the arguments before the court, it didn't look like they were going to wholly support the appellate court, which I thought the appellate court did a really good job, and I'm not sure that the Supreme Court's going to back them up completely over this, but we will see.
What do you think? What do you think will be their argument for it?
I think that the argument that some of them were making was, look, the government has what they call compelling interests. And it could be national security, it could be a pandemic, it could be that people get proper information, and when the government deems a compelling interest, they should at least be in the position to advise these platforms, right? So I think that's the argument they're going to make. It's a terrible argument,
but the question is this, Yaron. The question is, that could be a very far-reaching argument or a narrow one, because the question is, will they apply it particularly to things like Facebook, which is, quote, a public platform, so it's like the utilities and it's regulated by government? Do you think that the Supreme Court will go so far as to say the government can ban a book which disagrees with their COVID policies? See, I find that hard to believe.
Yeah, I don't think they'll go all the way, and I don't think they'll even say the government can ban it on Facebook. I think part of the discussion is, can the government put this soft pressure on? We'll be upset, as you said, we'll be upset if you, and I think the court is going to side with the government on that part of it and say you can't ban it outright, but you can advise, you can recommend, you can suggest, which we know is the same thing, but
yeah.
I fear that that's where they're going to come out with some kind of mixed message, and it's going to be bad.
That's terrible. I'm having fun interviewing you.